I'm going to tell you a little bit about the journey that I've been on the past 6+ years now. So here's a quick summary of the talk, a little background about me. I'm going to talk a little bit about my early days at Greenhouse as the first and only data scientist and what that was like and some of the lessons that I learned. Then the next phase was maturing the data organization. And again, maybe some lessons learned there and things that I would, if I had them to do over, I might do differently. And then most recently, why I've decided to move from data science into analytics engineering. Because something had nothing to do with the part. So it's been a little bit of a journey. I did my PhD in astrophysics at Johns Hopkins quite a while ago now. So doing research, mentoring students, studying galaxies, all that kind of good stuff. My last academic position, my wife and I were living in Copenhagen, Denmark, which was very nice. And then our son was born over there, and we thought, hey, it'd be great if we could move back to the States. For those of you that know something about the academic job market, it's not always easy to choose where you end up living. And so thankfully, around that time, data science was becoming more and more of a thing, more of a career option for me. I actually had a colleague in Copenhagen who went through the Insight data science program, and that's how I knew about that program. For those of you that don't know, Insight was basically formed for the express purpose of taking people like me, academics with some quantitative background, and putting them into data science jobs. So I did that back in 2014 in New York, and Insight partners with a bunch of different companies. So you work on a project for a few weeks, it's pretty intense, and you shop that project around as your job application. So I did that demo for Facebook, I think twice somehow, Spotify, NBC Universal, and finally Greenhouse. And so why did I pick Greenhouse? Certainly, I'd heard of Facebook and Spotify and some of these other companies that I'd done this demo for and that were partnering with Insight back then. And I think we had one of the co-founders of Greenhouse, the now CTO of Greenhouse, also came to Insight to give us their pitch. And I found it pretty compelling. Greenhouse is an applicant tracking system at its core. We've added more products around that since these early days. And I think even in academia, I could see the risk of having bad matches, making a bad hire, or maybe it wasn't on you, it was on the candidate, that it's not like a great fit for them. And that can have a really serious impact on your research in academia or your business out in the world. And so I felt like any tool out there that could improve that process, but for both sides, both the candidate and the employer, was doing good work and could be very impactful for the world. And I think it seemed like they had a lot of interesting data. Obviously, it was very hard for me to tell what state that data was in, what shape that data would take until I was actually there. The collection of structured data for hiring purposes is our thing at Greenhouse. And so even in these early days, let me just go to the next slide. Even in those early days, so I was employee 35-ish. Greenhouse has been around for a couple of years. At that point, I had hundreds of customers, was adding them at a good clip. It really seemed like this approach to structured hiring and collecting good data, relatively unbiased data, hopefully, on candidates was resonating with the market. So it was exciting. I think I felt like, sure, this is a great company. I think we're going good places. I think we're doing good in the world, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, I think even though data collection around candidates was so core to the philosophy and to the product, the usage of data internally to the business wasn't very mature. I was the first data hire. The co-founders, I think generally were working from their guts, so to speak, and maybe not doing rigorous analysis to try to figure out what feature to build next or things like that. Maybe not surprisingly. It was exciting that I got hired, and there were lots of new opportunities when I showed up, but it's a little bit hard. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what's the most valuable thing for me to work on right away, especially for me coming out of academia, I would say. And so back in 2014, the data was there to support the product, right? I was the first person to look at the database not as the backing for a software application, but for a place to go for answers to analytical questions. And as I think many of us have probably experienced, that data is potentially in some very strange shapes and you have to write some pretty tortured SQL to even just to count something or to answer some of these analytical questions. And so the schema, like I said, was optimized for running this ATS, and I was the first person to come along and try to optimize it for a very different use case, for this analytical use case. So we're in the quote unquote pre-data warehouse stage, and I'm querying replicas in production and things like that, which is not great. So I would say, coming from academia, I think there was quite a few sort of cultural differences. The pace of work, the expectations around deliverables. In academia, I might have had a small data set that I collected over the course of a year, took another year to analyze it, took another 6 months or something to write it up in a journal article. But that kind of timeline is certainly not going to fly, especially at a startup. The goal certainly for Greenhouse was, can we start to build this new muscle? Can we start to use our data not just to support the application, but for analytics as well? And so we're on the hunt for some quick wins. And I think some of the skills that I was able to bring from academia around communication and some SQL and Python skills and things like that were very quickly useful. But at the same time, I think it took us a little bit to hit on some projects that were really genuinely valuable and that were seen by, let's say, the executives or the co-founders as being a great example of this new approach to using our data for other things. So like the lessons here, I would say, iterating quickly, communicating effectively to these less technical stakeholders, and being able to apply this iterative like 80-20 approach, rather than, I think in academia, you could pretty much qualify it as like more like a waterfall approach. So having done that, like one project in particular that involved me writing a ton of SQL, but it was really just the first view that we were able to construct of how our users were using our product, who had which features turned on, how many jobs were people opening, how many candidates were they getting, all those kind of pretty basic, in retrospect, pretty basic questions that we hadn't had answers to before. That was maybe the first project where that was getting data in the hands of executives that I think they were finding useful. That sort of generated some buy-in for further investment. So it was still just me. We had an internal transfer from a different team, a person that knew some SQL. And then it wasn't until 2019 where we were able to basically get this further investment. So we worked really hard to try to figure out who to hire and how to hire them, what we were looking for in terms of our next data hires. And we're a recruiting company. And so we wanted to make sure that we did that part well, because we know how important it is. So this could be a completely separate talk about hiring data scientists. But the one thing I'll say is that we figured out that we wanted to target generalists with some work experience. And we wanted to come up with a job pipeline that was really differentiating amongst candidates that might apply for that kind of job. And the one thing that I'm most proud of is that we came up with a take-home test that was easy, wasn't too time consuming, was easy for the candidates to get up and running. They didn't have to install anything, was all hosted, all that kind of thing. And we found that it was actually very differentiating, because there were technical components. So we tested their SQL and things like that. But there was also non-technical. So run some SQL and then explain that back to a less technical stakeholder. And that was, those responses varied very widely. And that was useful for us in deciding who to hire. So that brings us to today. So we have a team of 4 data scientists. Part of that maturing sort of the data org was to bring on some more tooling along with these new hires. And now I think we're ready to realize some of the ambitions that we might have had for a while. Certainly in the past, we've had ideas about different machine learning projects or customer-facing features that could be very data-driven, but maybe we felt like we didn't have the capacity to build those things ourselves, or we didn't have enough data, or the data wasn't in good enough shape to support those ambitions. But now I think we're there, we're at this inflection point. And like I said, there's 4 data scientists, there's 1 data engineer, And we've identified that there's this gap in between, which is this analytics engineering role that's still relatively new. But I think it's key right now that we fill that gap so that we can build these robust data sets that would support like more machine learning use cases and so on. And I think because I've been there, so I have a lot of domain knowledge. I was doing analytics engineering in the early days before it was called such. So I'm really excited to step into this role and hopefully fill that gap. And then maybe after a year or so, or after I'm quote unquote done, I can come back and reap some of the rewards of this foundational work. The last thing I just wanted to say, I love this, I guess you could call it a comic from Jessica Hagee about getting too comfortable. So I've been at Greenhouse for more than 6 years up until now as a data scientist, doing a lot of similar work, not identical work, but similar work over the years. And so I'm excited to step out of that role and step into this new role where I think I'll find some new challenges and I'll have to learn some new things, specifically like on the engineering side, writing tests and building more complex systems, more robust systems that are monitored and more easily maintained and things like that. And I also think Greenhouse has been flexible enough with me that I'm calling this like a tour of duty. So I'm going to step into this role and, like I said, hopefully build a bunch of useful foundational stuff, and then maybe step into a different role and find some new challenges and learn some new things, whether that's going back to data science or whether that's machine learning engineer or what have you. And then there's just like a brief summary slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was awesome. One of the things I really like about kind of Andrew's story and kind of his journey is that I think too often, I think folks will just think that like my version of kind of my career is either going to management or getting to more and more specialized. And I think what kind of I love Andrew's focus on really just always finding a great place to next step to learn. And again, there are so many cool aspects of data, and even like these data engineer, analytics engineer, I think they are all kind of oversimplifications of other titles. And so I just encourage you to don't feel like you have to fit in a box. Don't feel like you always have to be learning, focusing on one thing. There's many different paths and there's many different opportunities to learn the data. And again, like if you ever have, and if you're coming from, an academic background, Andrew's a phenomenal person to chat with to get advice on just how to navigate kind of that transition and also other transitions. So we got some great questions.
Thank you.
Jeremy Owens said, asked you,
Hi,
Andrew,
Jeremy.
at Greenhouse, how do you differentiate the data engineer and analytics engineer roles?
I think we're still figuring it out a little bit. Our one data engineer right now is coming from the software engineering world. And so I think he has that perspective of definitely writing tests and understanding how to build systems of code better than a data scientist does. I think at least me as an analytics engineer, I'm definitely coming from the data side. And so I'm thinking, is there sort of part of the spectrum between the engineering and the data science that's probably a little bit more towards the data side for me, but learning enough engineering that I can build something that's a more robust tool set or data set or system than like the average data scientist might be able to.
And then we got another good one. Mindy, hot off of her raffle win, is asking a question about what skills as a data scientist, machine learning engineer do you leverage as you stepped into new responsibilities as an analytics engineer?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's definitely, I'm back in SQL land more now. So I think understanding how to validate and reshape data, something that, obviously like I had to do, I was like the one-stop shop for data stuff early on. And I was able to get away from that a little bit, more like building dashboards or data products. So I would say some of those skill sets are coming back into play as I move into analytics engineering.
And Mindy added that coming from a data science background and moving towards analytics engineering, she wanted to know where the data came from and write better code, production level code that she's leveraging kind of her analytics point of view and leveling up software engineering skills, which I think is a really great take. Again, like I think there's so many skills, and I think like folks that go, it's fun to be T-shaped, and your T can have multiple kind of vertical slices, and so leveling up those skills is super, super helpful.